I never thought I'd reach a point where I'd walk away from my parents forever. But when they chose a vacation over saying goodbye to my grandfather, the man who had been more of a parent to me than they ever were, something inside me broke. It wasn't an easy decision. It wasn't something I woke up one day and just decided to do. It was years of disappointments, of feeling like an afterthought, of watching them prioritize their wants over my needs. My grandfather's funeral was just the final straw. I remember the moment I got the call from my aunt. Her voice was quiet, fragile, the kind of voice you use when you're trying not to break. "He's gone," she whispered. "He passed peacefully in his sleep." I stood in the middle of my apartment, gripping the phone so tightly my fingers went numb. The world around me blurred, and for a moment, I felt like a little kid again, standing in my grandfather's garden, listening to his stories about his childhood. "Did you tell Mom and Dad?" I asked after a long pause. Aunt Miriam hesitated. "I did. They said they'd send flowers. But they're still going on their trip." At first, I thought I had misheard her. "What?" "They said they already paid for everything," she continued, her voice laced with something between frustration and disbelief. "Flights, hotels, tours. They didn't want to lose the money." I swallowed hard, my heart hammering against my ribs. "He's their father." "I know," she sighed. "But they made up their minds. They made up their minds. Just like that. As if my grandfather's death was an inconvenience. As if canceling a vacation was too much to ask for." I don't remember hanging up. I don't remember how long I stood there, staring at nothing, feeling my emotions war between grief and rage. But I do remember packing. The funeral was 2 days later. A small, quiet ceremony. People who loved my grandfather gathered, sharing stories, tears, and memories. I gave the eulogy. I spoke about the man who had always been there for me when my parents were too busy. The man who taught me how to ride a bike, how to plant a garden, how to listen instead of just hearing. I tried not to think about the empty seats where my parents should have been. When it was over, I turned my phone back on. There were no missed calls from them. No texts. No messages asking how the funeral went or if I was okay. That was when I knew. It wasn't just about the funeral. It was about everything. Every missed school play, every forgotten birthday, every time I had to pretend I wasn't disappointed when they chose themselves over me. I couldn't do it anymore. The day they got back from their vacation, I was waiting for them. The house I grew up in looked the same, but it didn't feel like home anymore. It hadn't for a long time. They walked through the front door, laughing about some resort story. My mother's sun-kissed skin glowed as she set her bags down, barely looking at me. "Oh," she said, surprised. "You're here." "Yeah," I replied, my voice flat. "I'm here." Dad glanced at me, his brow furrowing. "Something wrong? Something wrong. Something wrong." I let out a bitter laugh, shaking my head. "Yeah, actually. Something is very wrong." Mom sighed dramatically, already tired of a conversation she hadn't even had yet. "Look, we know you're upset, but what were we supposed to do? The trip was paid for. We couldn't just." "You could have," I interrupted, my voice sharp. "You could have, but you didn't. You made a choice. And now I'm making mine." They stared at me as I set my keys on the table. "I'm done." Silence. Mom blinked. "Done with what?" "With this," I gestured between us. "With trying. With pretending like I mean as much to you as you mean to me. I lost someone I loved, and you were too busy sipping cocktails on a beach to care." Dad scoffed. "Oh, come on. That's not fair." "No, what's not fair is that I've spent my whole life making excuses for you," I snapped. "Telling myself that maybe next time you'll show up. That maybe next time you'll put me first. But there's never a next time, is there?" Mom's lips pressed into a thin line. "So what? You're just going to cut us out of your life over this?" I met her gaze, steady and unwavering. "Yeah. I am." Dad ran a hand down his face. "Jesus, you're being dramatic." "Am I?" I exhaled slowly, trying to keep my composure. "Do you even know what day he died? What time? Who was with him when he took his last breath?" They didn't answer. "Of course you don't," I said quietly. Because you weren't there. Mom folded her arms. We didn't think it would be this big of a deal. I stared at her, my chest tightening. Then that's the problem, isn't it? The silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating. Dad shook his head. You'll get over this. You always do. I laughed, but it felt hollow. No, Dad. This time, I won't. I turned and walked out the door, not waiting for them to call me back. Because I knew they wouldn't. They had already made their choice. And I had made mine. When I walked out of my parents' house that day, I thought I'd feel relief. Like a weight had been lifted. But instead, there was just emptiness. I drove home in silence, my fingers gripping the steering wheel like it was the only thing keeping me grounded. The radio stayed off. My phone buzzed a few times, probably my aunt checking in, or maybe a distant relative offering condolences. But it wasn't them. Of course, it wasn't them. They wouldn't call. Wouldn't text. Wouldn't chase after me. Because, in their eyes, I was the one being unreasonable. I packed that night. I hadn't planned on it, hadn't even been sure where I was going, but suddenly, staying felt unbearable. The apartment I had spent years making my own felt smaller, suffocating, filled with memories of phone calls that went unanswered and visits that were always postponed. I stuffed clothes into a suitcase, grabbed the essentials, and by the time the sun rose, I was already on the road. I needed space. I needed to breathe. I needed to be somewhere that didn't remind me of them. The first few days were strange. I ended up in a small town a few hours away, checking into a quiet motel with nothing but my suitcase and the exhaustion weighing me down. I ignored calls from people who actually cared. My aunt, a few close friends. Even my boss. I didn't want to talk. Didn't want to explain. I just wanted to disappear. But grief doesn't work like that. It doesn't care how far you run. It follows you, creeping into the quiet moments, waiting until you're alone with your thoughts before sinking its claws in. I thought about my grandfather constantly. About how he was always there when I needed him. About how he never made me feel like I had to fight for his attention or prove I was worth his time. He would have been disappointed in them. But more than that, he would have been proud of me. I clung to that thought on the days when the loneliness crept in. Because, for the first time in my life, I wasn't waiting for my parents to care. And that had to mean something. A week passed before my mother finally reached out. A single text. Are you done being dramatic? I stared at the words on my screen, my chest tightening. Not how are you? Not we're sorry. Not even can we talk. Just that. Like I had thrown some tantrum. Like my pain was nothing more than an inconvenience. I should have ignored it. Should have deleted it and moved on. But instead, I did something I hadn't done in years. I told the truth. No, Mom. I'm done waiting for you to love me the way I deserve. I hit send before I could take it back. Her reply came almost instantly. Don't be ridiculous. And that was it. No apology. No acknowledgement. Just dismissal. Like always. I laughed, actually laughed, as I tossed my phone onto the motel bed. Because for the first time, I saw it clearly. They were never going to change. They weren't capable of it. By the second week, I stopped checking my phone. I focused on myself instead. I took long walks through the unfamiliar streets, letting the fresh air clear my mind. I sat in quiet coffee shops, reading books I had been meaning to get to for years. I even picked up a journal, writing down everything I had never been able to say out loud. And slowly, so slowly, the grief began to shift. It didn't go away. I don't think it ever will. But it started to feel different. Like something I could carry, rather than something that carried me. I thought about my grandfather a lot. And for the first time in weeks, the memories didn't just hurt. They reminded me of who I was before my parents made me feel like I wasn't enough. And that? That was worth holding on to. By the third week, the silence from my parents was deafening. Not that I expected them to reach out. I had made my choice. They had made theirs. But still, some small, foolish part of me had thought, maybe. Maybe they would realize what they had done. Maybe they would show up, tell me they were sorry, that they had been wrong. That never happened. What did happen was worse. I was sitting in a diner one evening, stirring a cup of coffee that had long gone cold, when my phone buzzed. I had started leaving it on silent, but I happened to glance down and see a message from my aunt. "Call me when you can." Something about it felt urgent. I stepped outside, the air crisp against my skin as I dialed her number. She answered on the first ring. "Where are you?" she asked, skipping the pleasantries. "A few hours away," I said carefully. "Why?" She hesitated. "Your parents have been talking." I exhaled sharply. And, she sighed, "they're telling people you cut them off over something small. That you threw a fit because they didn't cancel a trip, and now you're ignoring them for no reason." I clenched my jaw. "Of course they are. I've been defending you," she continued, "but they're painting themselves as the victims. Saying they tried to talk to you, but you refused. That you're being stubborn." I let out a bitter laugh. "They sent me one text, Miriam. One. And it wasn't even an apology." "I know." Her voice softened. "But they're never going to see it that way. They'll never admit they were wrong." I closed my eyes, inhaling deeply. I knew this. Had always known it. But hearing it still hurt. "They're hosting a dinner this weekend," she added. "With the family. They want to explain things." "Explain things?" I repeated, stunned. "Like what?" "How they abandoned their responsibilities. How they didn't even care that he was gone." "I don't know," she admitted. "But I thought you should hear it from me before someone else brought it up." I ran a hand through my hair. "Are you going?" "Of course not." She sounded offended by the very idea. "I was going to visit you. If you'll have me." I swallowed hard. "Yeah," I murmured. "I'd like that." And for the first time in weeks, I didn't feel quite so alone. Aunt Miriam arrived the next afternoon, carrying a bag of takeout and a look that told me she had a lot to say. "How are you holding up?" she asked as she set the food down. I shrugged. "Better. Worse. Depends on the day." She gave me a knowing look. "That's grief for you." We ate in relative silence, but I could feel her watching me, waiting for the right moment to say what was really on her mind. Finally, she sighed. "I need to tell you something else." I tensed. "What now?" She hesitated. "Your parents, they already emptied his house." I froze. "What?" "They cleaned it out last week," she said carefully. "Sold most of the furniture. Took anything valuable." My stomach twisted. "Without telling me?" She looked pained. "They didn't think you'd care." I pushed my plate away, nausea creeping up my throat. That house was where I had spent half my childhood. It was where my grandfather had taught me how to cook, where he had told me stories late into the night, where I had felt safe when everything else in my life felt uncertain. And now it was gone. They didn't even ask. My voice shook. They didn't think they had to. I let out a humorless laugh, shaking my head. Of course they didn't. Of course they had taken what wasn't theirs, just like they always had. Something inside me hardened. I had thought I was done with them. Had thought I had already made my peace. But this? This was unforgivable. 2 days later, I drove back to town. I hadn't planned to. Had sworn to myself that I wouldn't give them another second of my time. But standing outside my grandfather's now empty house, staring at the cold, lifeless shell of what once had been a home, I knew I needed closure. I needed to face them. I knocked on my parents' door. It took a few moments, but then my mother appeared, eyes widening in surprise. "Well, look who finally decided to show up," she said, arms crossing. I ignored the sting in my chest. "Where's his stuff?" She blinked. "Excuse me?" "Grandpa's things," I repeated, voice steady. "Where are they?" She sighed, as if I were exhausting her. "We sold most of it. Donated some." "What does it matter?" I felt something inside me snap. "It matters," I said through gritted teeth, "because that was his life. And you threw it away like garbage." She rolled her eyes. "You're being overdramatic again." "No," I cut her off. "You don't get to say that. Not this time." I turned to my father, who had appeared in the doorway behind her. "Did you even think about asking me?" He shrugged. You walked away. I let out a shaky breath, my hands clenched at my sides. I walked away because you made me feel like I didn't matter. They didn't argue. Didn't deny it. Because, deep down, they knew it was true. I swallowed hard. I just came to say one last thing. They waited. You don't exist to me anymore. My mother's mouth tightened, but she didn't speak. Dad just shook his head. You'll regret this. No, I said softly. I won't. And this time, when I walked away, I did feel lighter. Because I wasn't just leaving them. I was finally free. Leaving my parents' house that final time felt different. There was no hesitation, no lingering doubt, no aching hope that they would call me back. They wouldn't. And for the first time in my life, I didn't want them to. I drove away without looking in the rearview mirror. Without wondering if I was making the right decision. Without questioning if I was being too harsh, too emotional, too me. Because I finally understood, I wasn't the problem. They were. Aunt Miriam was waiting for me when I got back. She took one look at my face and didn't ask a single question. Just handed me a cup of tea and sat with me in silence. Did you say everything you needed to? She asked eventually. I nodded. Do you feel better? I thought about it. Not better, I admitted. Just, lighter. She smiled knowingly. That's a start. The next few weeks were quiet. I went back to work. Got back into my routine. But something had shifted. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel like I was waiting for something, waiting for love, for approval, for a sign that I was worth their time. I had given that up the moment I walked away. And strangely enough, I had never felt more at peace. One afternoon, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. Hello? Is this? The woman on the other end hesitated. Are you Charles's grandchild? I sat up straighter. Yes, I said cautiously. Who is this? My name's Margaret, she said gently. I was a friend of your grandfather's. I'm so sorry for your loss. I exhaled slowly. Thank you. He talked about you all the time, she continued. Said you were the best thing that ever happened to him. My throat tightened. He left something for you, she added. Before he passed. I blinked. He did? Yes. A letter. He wanted you to have it. My heart pounded. Where are you? Margaret was exactly the kind of person my grandfather would have been friends with, kind, warm, no nonsense. She met me at a small cafe and handed me an envelope. He wrote this not long before he passed, she explained. Told me to give it to you when the time was right. My fingers trembled as I took it. She patted my hand. Take your time, dear. I waited until I was alone to open it. My grandfather's handwriting was familiar, steady, unshaken by the illness that had taken him. My dear one. If you're reading this, then I'm gone. And if I know you at all, you're hurting. You always did feel things deeply, and that is one of your greatest gifts. I want you to know something, I was never disappointed in you. Not once. I have always been proud of you, proud of your kindness, your strength, your heart. I know your parents have never given you what you deserved. And I know how much that has hurt you. But I hope you understand now that their love was never a reflection of your worth. You were always enough. And you always will be. Live your life, my dear one. Live it fully. Without waiting for permission, without looking back. You have always been free, you just needed to see it. With all my love, Grandpa. Tears blurred the words, but I didn't wipe them away. For the first time since he died, I let myself cry. Not just for the loss. But for the love I had always had, the love that had never left me. I moved to a new city a few months later. Not to run away, but to start over. I built a life that was mine, surrounded myself with people who actually cared, who didn't make me feel like an afterthought. My parents never reached out again. And I never looked back. Because my grandfather was right. I had always been free. I just hadn't known it. And now? Now I did. Thank you for watching the video, like it if you watched the video to the end and don't forget to subscribe. Have a nice day.